Hello, hello, and good morning, and welcome to Intercultural Spark. Today's show, scheduled to be He Said, She Said, Perspectives in Daily Living in Black and White. And our guest was scheduled to be Lucky Church, who I know has had a lot of issues lately with surgery, and he lost someone. And so we're going to shift our show a little bit. We'll have a conversation today, but it'll be the she said, the she said part of it. So, this show is about intercultural talk, and we are going to talk about perspectives on daily living. And, the idea is to hopefully break down barriers in between people as how we interact with life and how the perception of life is different based on your cultural or racial background. So welcome to Intercultural Spark. Hi. So the plan today, and thank you for everyone who's tuning in. So I'm hoping that Lucky is okay. Our guest today, Lucky Church, we were going to have a conversation about perspectives on daily living in Black and White. I am here. I am going to go ahead and use some of our conversation starters that we have talked about. If you are here live, I'm going to encourage you to ask questions in the comments. But basically, the way that this came about, so Lucky Church he is the PR manager for Billy Porter. I mean, he's amazing. He's worked with DJ Khaled and all these amazing brands around the globe. And when he and I were connected through a mutual friend, Tom Martin, we're talking, and we were not on Zoom. We were just talking voice to voice. And Lucky started talking about his experience of going to the doctor. And he felt that as a Black man, he felt that maybe he was treated differently. And he was just about, I could tell where he was going. He was just about to say, like, oh, you know what I mean? Where I realized he thought that I was a Black woman. So I was like, oh, wait, as a white woman, here's how I feel about it. And it got us talking about the perspectives of what it's like to be in the world, and what the daily experience is of people based on their skin color or their ethnicity or all those different dimensions of diversity that we talk about. And I know for me, the time that it originally really hit home was at a time when I worked for the Chicago Park District back in the mid 90s, new to Chicago. And my office was at the South Shore Cultural Center, which is right by 79th and Shore Drive. So it's on the south side of Chicago. And there was a day that I went out to lunch, and I went to Walgreens, picked some things up and took some side streets back to avoid traffic getting back to my office. And I realized in that short little, just really normative thing of running errands, I did not see a single white person. And for me, being part of majority culture, it made me realize just how different that perspective is of life, in terms of being completely immersed in a different culture or a different race. And I'd had that experience before, but the other time that I'd had that experience was when I was on a school trip to Mexico. And so, of course, as being a white tourist or white visitor on a trip, I was the only person who was not Mexican. Duh, I was in Mexico. This was the first time that I'd had that experience being in the United States, in my own city, to see how different our perspectives on daily living are. So what Lucky and I talked about doing was using some of these diversity conversation flashcards. So these are from Lee Moon-Wah, who is also who's a diversity trainer and consultant, and has done a lot of work on diversity and inclusion and anti-racism. And these were cards that he put together. So it's a collection. I would say there's probably even like 500 of these cards. And there's 4 different categories. There is questions for people of color. So questions that white people would like to ask people of color, and also questions that people of color would like to be asked. And then there's also a section on questions for Euro-Americans. So questions that white people would like to be asked, but also questions that Black people have for white people. So we will reschedule our call with Lucky, but I thought as long as we were going to have this conversation, I'll go ahead and pull some of the cards that Black people have for white people and answer to the best of my ability. And of course, you know, I, which is so funny because I know I've heard people of color say, well, I can't be representative of my entire race. And yet sometimes in diversity and inclusion contexts, I've been led to understand that that's how Black people or people of color sometimes feel. All that to say that clearly I can't speak on behalf of all white people. And also things like gender and age and socioeconomic status and education, all those things are just additional layers that fill in to someone's identity and how they perceive life. So I'm just going to go ahead and do a couple of these. Okay, so these are questions that Lee Moon-Hwa had collected that people of color had for Euro Americans. And this question was, do you think people of color are just too lazy to make something of themselves? Why? So the first question is actually no, no, I don't think that. So that would be the short answer. But I also think that I think what I'm stammering is it's funny that the question was asked, because if this question was asked, then a person of color thought that that's what white people thought of them. So that's always challenging. I do think there's so many challenges in the world to realizing your dreams or to actually pursuing education and careers and all those kinds of things. And especially with the pandemic, like that has made it even harder. I think opportunity sometimes can be not as fair to everybody. And I think that with the pandemic going on, that you have to act like triple as hard. To me, it's more, and this is not race-based, but nowadays I feel like you just have to be willing to take chances. Like people really have to be willing to get out there and put themselves out there and make connections wherever you can, which is something that Lucky puts first and foremost, where it's making connections with people and then maintaining those connections. So the next question, and for people who are listening live, I appreciate if you have questions that you want to share. What we're doing today, our guest, Lucky Church, I hope that everything's okay, was not able to join us. We were going to go back and forth with questions on perspectives in daily living. And instead, I'm pulling some of these questions from Lee Moon-Hwa's approach, which is questions for Euro Americans from people of color. So the next question is, and these are just flashcards. So do you think that white males can personally help end discrimination? So I think that everybody can help end discrimination. Like, I think it can only start from yourself. What I wonder sometimes is I've been in meetings where, let's say the CEO is a person who's Caucasian, and they'll say, I know I'm part of the problem. Or I know I'm the problem. So I feel like, and I'd love to hear other people's perspective on this. Sometimes I feel like just being a white male doesn't actually mean it's a problem. It's how you exercise your the privilege that you have, or how you basically how you manifest and interact in the world. You know, I think that everybody ideally can end discrimination. I think that when diversity and inclusion first started years ago, it felt like it was even created through a white construct or a white paradigm. So it was kind of like, we're the people in power, and we're going to create systems to bring other people in. I think even that paradigm or that structure actually has sort of inequities built into it. Because when we talk about ending discrimination, it really is, how do we get to a point where people are equal in the sense that people aren't being prejudged based on color or race or ethnicity or things like that. And I think everybody has a role in that. People who are in a position of privilege or who tend to have more power, and certainly the statistics and numbers based on who CEOs are, wealth, all those kinds of things. Clearly in US American society, those numbers, basically show that white men do tend to be at the top, or they are at the top of that, of those numbers in most cases. And so I think you have to play a role in that. When you are in a position of privilege, I think you use that privilege to try to end discrimination. So we're going to do one more question, and then we'll go ahead and, oh boy, it's an easy one. So our last flashcard question is, where do you think racism comes from? So I think that racism comes from, naive child in me says it comes from just people being ignorant, because it really is ridiculous that or I guess sad, that people discriminate against others, particularly based on things that are more superficial. But I think we just have a long history of discrimination in the US that actually comes all the way back from when African Americans were first enslaved and brought to this country. And then when the Civil War ended, slavery ended, there's just been laws every step of the way that, whether overtly or inadvertently, have perpetuated that gap. So even things like the ability to purchase property, or, for example, laws for veterans but people of color actually then didn't have the same access to even be in the military. So then people come home from war, and so things are perpetuated there. So that was a terrible answer. Much better writer. I'm much better as a writer in terms of looking at topics. The complexity of where racism came from is so deep, and it's so entrenched. And I think you see it again and again. I have a guest coming up, Dr. Cheryl Ingram. She's going to be with me in a few weeks. She's a diversity and inclusion trainer who is a person of color. And she talked about how exhausting it was because it was so hard to separate the personal and the professional. And I thought, what do you mean? When I think of separating personal and professional, I think it's my choice, and that I'd rather live my life, fully and authentically. But what she was talking about is, as a diversity and inclusion trainer, as a person of color, like, people feel that they can ask her questions that are much more personal, and so the point of that is that those are just these these are unconscious things that you don't realize, that just daily life, from being awake and alive all day, there can be these different inequities isn't even the right word there, but certainly differences in unconscious biases. And going back to, and I'll actually even close with this, going back to the conversation that Lucky and I really had, or originally had, he was talking about being discriminated, that he felt through his health issues recently, that he was not treated the same as a Black man going into the medical and health profession. And, I have to joke, and I feel like this is sort of part of being a white, and probably also Jewish, as a white Jewish woman, like, I feel like doctors are there to give you suggestions. I think of having cancer 5 years ago, and I probably went through like 4 oncologists. I think I probably just didn't like having an oncologist, but what they were saying didn't make sense. They were telling me things, even things like, whether or not you should take tamoxifen, which is a drug that's sometimes prescribed to women after they've had breast cancer. But what they were saying didn't match me as a person. Like, what they were saying was in the books, it didn't match me. Now, I don't know if this is race-based, personality-based, but I know for me, I was like, yeah, I'm going to check with someone else. I'm going to get another perspective. So I feel like I've not had issues in the medical in getting medical care, but at the same time, I'm also really apt to ask a lot of questions, and to ask a lot of questions and to actually self-advocate. So the question really is, what I wonder is then, is that a racial issue or a personality issue? I'm guessing that there's racial undertones to it. And the thing that I would say to support that, my husband is Brazilian. He speaks with an accent. We both have the same insurance. And when we go to the doctor, he said they're always saying to him, well, who's going to pay for this? Who's responsible for your bill? Whereas I've never been asked for that. So I do wonder if that's a question of, I do actually think that that is a topic that, or I think that there's prejudice. I think there's prejudice there. So thanks to Stephanie. Stephanie says you're brave to take on this topic, applauding your responses, Deanna. It is complex, the vocabulary, nuances, and the everydayness of where we are. Thank you so much, Stephanie, and thank you for being here. And if people have questions, the other problem though, with the way that I'm doing it today is, my guest, Lucky, I hope everything is okay, was not able to make it. We were going to have, kind of a he said, she said. So there was a little bit more of a back and forth. So now what you have is me kind of babbling, because even as someone who writes about diversity and inclusion, even someone who, is in an interfaith, intercultural relationship, I hear myself using vague words. I mean, I hear myself trying to be abstract, to think of things hypothetically. And I think that's part of the problem, is people being afraid to actually really dig in and use real life examples, or to really ask questions, or to push where things are painful, or I would say to actually know where to push. Because often with diversity and inclusion, I think there's homework that you have to do on your own. It's important to know who you are and to own who you are before you start asking someone else, well, why are they that way? I think in closing, the one thing, it's not the one thing, there's so many things, but being culturally competent, or actually being comfortable talking about race, it's a practice. Number one, it's a practice. So the more you do it, the more comfortable you get. I was on a show the other day. I love the name of it. It's called Boss Up Goddess, with Elizabeth Ann Atkins. And she said, it's hard. How do you do it? And I had said, make sure that the conversation is about race. Sometimes just because we are of different backgrounds, it doesn't mean that race is actually at the basis of things. Oftentimes there's other things going on. So, it's a question of not necessarily inserting race or inserting ethnicity or diversity where it doesn't belong, but then not being afraid to talk about it where it does. So that is kind of thing. What I'm hoping is that we'll get, I hope that we'll get either Lucky back, or I really invite putting together a panel. There's a gentleman, his name's Emmanuel Achi, former football player. He has a YouTube channel, and what he does is he talks about, it's questions for a Black man. And he brings on other celebrities and stars where they're able to ask him questions about what his lived experience is like as a Black man in the US. And one of the most important phrases in that whole thing is lived experience. What we need to realize is that someone's lived experience is real. And when we don't understand other people, when we talk about racism, often it's like, oh, it's not like that for them, or, oh, they're taking it too seriously, or denying that someone felt what they did. So I think the first step, or the thing that maybe we'll leave with today, is understanding that someone's lived experience is real for them. And so when someone says, I experienced this slight, or I experienced this prejudice or this discrimination, rather than saying, oh, you're just imagining it, not that you would, but I'm sure that people have heard that, oh, you're imagining, or you're making too big of a deal of it. Maybe start with, what was that experience like for you? Because that was someone's lived experience. You can't deny what's actually happened to somebody. So maybe start there, and also start with what your own lived experience is. And maybe that's a jumping off point to be able to embrace other people and how they exist in the world, because we do each have different experiences. That's what makes it fabulous. I mean, that's what makes it so wonderful to interact. You can constantly learn and grow from other people, but we just need to understand or accept that my lived experience is just as valid for me as your lived experience is for you. And once we see that, then we're able to really see, well, hey, that's not such a great lived experience. are there ways to make that better? Are there ways to share and connect so that we can actually grow together? So, my friends, that was me babbling. That was me babbling for 30 minutes about, oh my gosh, on uh, what it's like for race and ethnicity, trying to kind of own my own experience as a white woman, and then pretty much babbling because it's hard. It's hard, and I think sometimes it's helpful to have feedback, which is probably good anyway, rather than trying to solve things in a vacuum. If we can solve things together and get more feedback and actually interaction, that's how we can build relationships. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you for Aaron or Jerry who are watching later. And I appreciate your comments and support. And of course, leave things in the comments. Thank you. Bye-bye.